Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader, and today we're reviewing Myths of Geography, 8 Ways We Get the World Wrong by Paul Richardson. So this global politics book takes the opposite end of traditional geopolitics. It basically argues that you cannot explain the world really through geography, and that you have a bunch of myths of geography related to continents and borders and nations, and about Russian expansionism and China. Now this is a refreshing take on geopolitics, because a lot of geopolitics authors are very deterministic. They think that geography is the most important factor, or not only that, but that it's the determining factor. Now I of course believe that geography is important, but it shouldn't discount free will. And this author does not discount free will. So there's about 8 myths about geography that he talks about in this book. Most of them are related to geography, but a couple not really. So the first myth he talks about are continents and how arbitrary their borders are, and that they don't really make any sense. And this is especially true with the border that distinguishes Europe and Asia, because the border between Europe and Asia for the past few centuries has been set at the Urals mountains. Now the thing is, the Ural mountains at certain points aren't even that big. And at certain points of the so-called border between Europe and Asia, they peter out into nothing. And then the borders between that and the Caucasus Mountains are very slim rivers that separate Asia and Europe. So that's actually a quite strong argument about why the division of continents between Europe and Asia don't make any sense. That's why the term Eurasia is quite important actually when you talk about certain things. In my belief, at least, Europe is still useful as a concept, as a cultural one at least, but lumping all of Asia together into one blob when it's so diverse, of course, doesn't really make that much sense. Next myth that he talks about is the myth about borders. And here he just goes on a tirade about his strong dislike for border walls. How the American-Mexican border wall makes the United States and Mexico less secure, not more, because it forces migrants to take riskier routes, such as going through a big desert between Mexico and the United States and then subsequently dying off first. Or in other border walls, you have people, who impale themselves on the walls and die. And then of course, when it's harder to come into a country illegally, then you may have to resort to more unscrupulous people to get you into the country. And of course, there's a certain truth of this also with Europe and Africa, where you have people who take these boats from there to Europe, and then they sink in the Mediterranean and drown. Now, of course, this is sad, but it's not a strong argument against borders, or that borders are myths. Next, he talks about the myth of nations, and that he says that nations are invented and they're not immutable. Now, in a sense, this is true, because the idea of the nation state goes back to nationalism in the 19th century with the French Revolution. And he talks about that even the idea of a civic nation is not always sustained. So he basically argues that with the rise of populism in the Anglosphere, that these civic nations of the United States and the United Kingdom are becoming more xenophobic and more intolerant of outsiders, so-called. And he also talks about an interesting case of the Windrush generation. So there was a period in British history, like soon after the post-war period in the late 40s and 50s. If you were a citizen of the British Empire, then you had basically equal rights to citizens of Britain to move to Britain. So then you had a bunch of people from the Caribbean who moved to Britain in the 40s and 50s and integrated into the country, but they never obtained passports, but they were citizens nonetheless. However, then in the 2010s, for some reason, the British government destroyed the landing cards of these citizens, which got rid of evidence that they were legally allowed to live in Britain. And now, slowly, there's been a bunch of laws passed to criminalize these people living in Britain even though they've been here for a generation. So that's, of course, just morally wrong. It's also dumb when you think about it for Britain's long-term economic prospects, because with how their demographics are, they cannot exactly afford to get rid of people who are already in Britain and who are proud to be British. Next chapter is about the myth of sovereignty. I'm sorry, sovereignty is not a myth. But he basically says that sovereignty is a myth because Brexit is irrational, and when Britain leaves the European Union, they actually decreased their margin for maneuver with trade deals and with prosperity. For example, Britain has been quite lackluster in creating new trade deals with countries like the United States and Canada since it has left the EU. Now, it is true that since Britain has left the EU, it has kind of kneecapped itself. But that does not mean that sovereignty is a myth, because sovereignty is that the government has control over a certain territory. And he argues that, oh, but you have multiple layers of government, so they don't have exclusive control, because the Scottish government has some control in Scotland. Sure, but that does not change that you have one source of national power in Britain, or federal power, if you will. And their sovereignty, of course, allowed them to leave the European Union. And of course, you cannot discount sovereignty if you talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because that's an issue of Ukrainian sovereignty, where Ukraine wants to be part of Project Europe. Russia doesn't want this. So Russia tries to crush Ukraine's margin for maneuver. Next, he talks about the myth of measuring growth. This chapter has nothing to do with geography. I mean, nothing. He says that, oh, GDP measurement is bad because it does not account for environmental impact, which, sure, that's a problem. That's why we have new indexes to measure development. And he also talks about how maybe we should be looking at happiness instead, and health, to measure how good a nation is. Now, sure, those things can be important, but first of all, measuring happiness is a bit arbitrary, because how people respond in surveys and how satisfied with their lives they are may depend on culture. And it may not necessarily reflect reality, and it ignores the fact that it's not the responsibility of the powers that be to make us happy. That's a personal responsibility everyone has to themselves. So measuring that as a form of development and prioritizing that over GDP doesn't make sense. But sure, sustainability is important in measuring stuff, and you also have the problem of China and India polluting a lot. So they have high economic growth, but they're also destroying their environments and hurting the lives of their countries in the future through this economic growth. However, he goes much further. He's basically attacking capitalism and inequality in this chapter, and it even seems he kind of thinks that the idea of degrowth is a serious idea, which, no, people want to get out of poverty. That's why we have the term sustainable development that combines taking climate change into account but still having GDP growth, because we still have, what, about 10% of the world population or so in absolute poverty, and then a majority of people still don't have that high living standards. So of course they want to grow their wealth. Next chapter is about Russian expansionism. And here he does a very good job at showing that the idea of Russian expansionism is not inherent to geography. A lot of the basis of this idea of geographical determinism making Russia imperialist is based on the final testament that Peter the Great gave, where he asked future Russian leaders to continue to expand the borders of the Russian Empire. Now, first of all, that testament was a forgery. It was not real. It was a fake invented by Western powers. Russia, although sure it has a tendency to be expansionist, has not always been expansionist. Even under Putin in the 2000s, voluntarily gave up territory on the Amur River to China, and was even considering doing so for Japan in exchange for a peace treaty. And also, a lot of this idea of Russian geographical expansionism is based on a myth that I did not realize was a myth, that Russia is seeking a warm water port. This is so-called the reason why it annexed Crimea to get the port of Sevastopol. But this ignores the fact that Russia already has a warm water port in Murmansk. And also now you have technology to break frozen seas, such as part of the Arctic Sea. So then you can have trade that way. So you don't need to conquer more and more and more. And even if they had control of Crimea, they still have to pass through the Bosphorus Strait and Gibraltar or the Suez Canal to access world trade. Part of the rationale for example, giving Kaliningrad to Russia during the peace settlement of World War II was this warm water port idea. So this idea is very enmeshed in the Western foreign policy mind. But the thing is, even Kaliningrad isn't that effective as a warm water port, since you still have to pass through Baltic Sea powers that are rivals with Russia, such as Western Germany and Denmark and Sweden. This author basically argues that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is basically driven by a survival instinct of Putin, and of Putin becoming more and more unreasonable over time, which there is a lot of truth to that. The next chapter is about China's new Silk Road. He basically argues that it's not only about geopolitics, but it's also about economic surplus value, where China has all this labor and capital it wants to put to use, but it cannot do so at home, so it needs to go to other places to do so. And also this talk about the new Silk Road ignores the climate risks and the unsustainability of a lot of these projects. This chapter is both nuanced at the same time, but also a little contradictory. Because there are times in this book where this author says, oh, it's not about geopolitics, oh, it kind of is, so he's not always that coherent in his argument. But the basic argument in this chapter is that the new Silk Road is not an attempt by China to gain the control of the heartland of the world island, which is an old geopolitics idea that who controls the heartland controls the world, which in a sense wasn't that true during the Cold War when you think about it, because the Soviet Union kind of controlled the heartland, maybe not all of it, but most of it for the most part, and it did not control the world. It lost the Cold War. The final chapter is about the myth that Africa is doomed to fail. And here he basically argues, first of all, you cannot lump Africa as one, that it's extremely diverse and that it has a diverse history of, both tribal societies, but also some civilizations, such as the Abyssinian Empire. He basically blames Africa's problem nowadays on European imperialism and neglectful decolonization, and that we shouldn't have a balanced view of imperialism and its effects. He basically argues that it was really bad, and that the argument that we need to have a balanced view of imperialism silences diverse voices. But this author misses the point. Having a nuanced view on imperialism, you can still say overall imperialism was a bad thing or overall imperialism was a good thing, but it's undeniable that it had both some positive and some negative effects. Depending on the place you look at the world, it may have had more positive or more negative effects. For example, in the Belgian Congo, no doubt it had way more negative effects, but it's not a black and white issue. And remember, this is a book about the myths of geography, but he does not discuss the many geographical reasons that contribute to Africa being poor. There's natural borders that lead to unity or disunity. So Africa has a lot of environmental barriers, which creates a proliferation of the development of ethnic groups. Now, they're not inherent ethnic groups, but still, geographical boundaries makes them separate and harder to centralize, and of course that makes the region inherently more prone to conflict. Now, of course, this can be overcome. This is being overcome slowly, but this author completely disregards this. So, how would I rate Myths of Geography? I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. So I strongly recommend you to read this, especially if you like reading geopolitics books. It gives you another very important perspective. But the author goes to the other extreme. He doesn't seem to think that geography has that much importance in the world. Now, sure, geography over time has less importance, but it's still a relevant factor in history. And some of the myths of geography he talks about here aren't even about geography. A lot of this book is him just discounting geography and then ranting and having contempt for the concepts of geopolitics, capitalism, and the West. So I definitely recommend you to read this book, but read it with a strong grain of salt. And if you want another perspective on geopolitics that's relatively balanced, that this author, by the way, does not address at all in this book, then you should check out my review of The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan. Otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.